So I wanted to talk about remembering, Remembering, repeating, and working through, which, as I said in the little flyer, I think is the heart and the soul of psychoanalysis. And I say that because I think of the various elements in psychoanalysis. And I think, well, there's the use of the unconscious. There's either, depending on what your religion is, there are either drives or they're motivational systems, or there's impulses or there's feelings. Okay, every school has its own favorite word. And there is repetition, and there are defenses, and there's all those things. But I don't think that I can really conceptualize of psychoanalysis without repetition. There are other psychologies that use the unconscious, and there's no problem at all with that. There's other psychologies that use defense mechanisms, and there are therapies that work by working clearly in the here and now. But I think that what makes psychoanalysis unique is a combination of the unconscious and the concept of repetition. That's really where I'd say that most of us would find some degree of common ground. And I like this paper because in it, Freud is so clear, he is so concise, there is so little jargon, and once you get past those first few pages where he's reviewing some historical information, which may or may not be interesting, and some of it is interesting, he gets on a roll and he basically gives you, in about 8 pages, a paper that tells you 3 different things. It is a theory of pathology. Now, I'm going to use that word psychopathology, but I'm going to use that word reluctantly. I don't really like that word very much. So I'm going to tell you very specifically the meaning that I assign to it in psychoanalysis. Psychopathology are the internal, intrapsychic, mind, subjective elements, whatever you want to call it, that prevent people from getting what they want in reality. Okay? So in other words, psychopathology is really defined by what you are frustrated by, what you can't get, and why you can't get it for reasons that are in your mind and not in the world. Now, reasons you can't get things that are in the world, that we don't have a hell of a lot of control of, and the world is not a terribly generous place. But what we're trying to do in psychoanalysis is help people overcome the internal obstacles to getting what they want. So Freud has a theory of psychopathology. He also has a theory of how this pathology unfolds in the treatment relationship. And finally, he has a theory of cure. So all of that in about 9 pages. So before we actually get into that paper, I want to read a couple of quotes from one that was written just a few years earlier called The Dynamics of the Transference, which is also a wonderful paper, and I suggest that you read it, but it isn't quite as accessible as this one. But it's got one wonderful sentence very near the beginning. And he says, "Let us bear clearly in mind that every human being has acquired, by the combined operation of inherent disposition and external influences in childhood, a special individuality in the exercise of his capacity to love. That is, in the conditions which he sets up for loving, in the impulses he gratifies by it, and in the aims he sets out to achieve in it." There's an awful lot in that sentence. Okay, the first part I want to underline is combined operation of inherent disposition and external influences in childhood. Somehow, people these days often have the ludicrous idea that Freud did not pay any attention to the external world. Utterly ridiculous. So he's not saying anything perhaps revolutionary by talking about internal and external here, but nevertheless, I wanted to say it because the external world was present from the beginning. And actually, in a footnote to this paragraph, he defends himself against the charge that he spends too much focus on external reality. People were complaining at the time that he wasn't paying enough attention to Constitution. So now, somehow or another, he's gotten lambasted for only paying attention to Constitution. But that was never the case. More important than that are the next parts of the sentence. A special individuality. Okay? Whatever Freud did in terms of his schemas, in terms of his theories, his developmental theories, he was always interested in the individual. Every single case was unique, no matter how many things it had in common with other cases. And what's he talking about? The capacity to love. Now, he's not talking about drive discharge. He's not talking about object relations. He's not talking about the defensive operations. What he's talking about is love, the most simple and most important of human activities, perhaps. Now, we might even say that this is a little too narrow. It's not just capacity to love. It's capacity to hate. It's capacity to express oneself. It's capacity to realize one's ambitions. There are many other things one might add, but I like that what Freud focuses on here is the capacity to love. And these days, in theory, where we're constantly talking about the importance of relationships, I think it's very valuable to remember that Freud was talking about relationships and the capacity to have relationships right at the beginning of his theory. And indeed, in a letter he wrote to Jung at about the same time, he described psychoanalysis as a cure through love. And he actually doesn't mean in that passage that it's about the analyst loving the patient, although that may come up a little later in the talk. But it's the patient's love for the analyst that's aroused in the treatment relationship that allows the cure to take place. So right at the beginning of psychoanalysis, we are talking about relationships, first and foremost. Everything else, all the other theories, all the subsidiary theories, those are all elements that go into the idea of what enables us to love and what stops us from loving. And then he goes on and then he describes what he wants to be what the individual wants to be gratified in love, what it is that they're seeking their love, how do they want to love, and how do they want to be loved. That is what every person has, and that's sort of the basis of his thinking. Okay? So let's move on now to the next paper. That was in, I think, 1912, maybe 1910. So a few years later, he wrote this one. And like I said on the flyer, I'm going to start right in the middle of a sentence of the first paragraph. Okay? We may say that the patient does not remember anything of what he has forgotten and repressed, but acts it out. He reproduces it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats it without, of course, knowing that he is repeating it. So here we get right into the heart of the matter, which is that people have memories, people don't remember their memories, and memories are expressed through action, through living. Now, somewhere along the line, the term acting out got to be quite pejorative, right? We tell people they're not supposed to act out. Acting out seems to mean you're being bad, you're doing something wrong. But he's emphasizing here, and we get this through the next page and a half, that he's not emphasizing that there's nothing bad. I'm emphasizing that. He's just saying it is. This is a condition of living. This is how we live in the world. Those memories which we cannot have, instead we act, we might say more contemporaneously, we enact in our relationships and in the relationship to the therapist. So this is what the situation is when somebody comes in. They are acting in the world and they are acting in the relationship. And what are they acting? Things that they can't remember. Okay? So then he goes through a number of different examples of this. The patient does not say that he remembers that he used to be defiant and critical to his parents' authority. Instead, he behaves that way to the doctor. Okay? So how the patient is talking to you right away is giving you some sense of some aspect of their relationships. Now, at this point in his theory, Freud's really talking about, and throughout his theory, he's usually talking about feelings about other people. Again, strongly relationally oriented. These days, we might add, based on other stuff that Freud wrote later, that the patient might relate to you the way they relate to themselves. We call that a narcissistic relationship. And that would also be repeated. That's not something he's talking about here, though. Okay? What's another example? He does not remember how he came to a helpless and hopeless deadlock in infantile sexual researches, but he produces a mass of confused dreams and associations, complains he cannot succeed in anything, and asserts that he's fated never to carry through on anything he undertakes. How many times have we heard things like that? We may not agree now that it's because he couldn't figure out sexuality at some point. We may think of many other reasons, many other etiologies for this degree of confusion. But the confusion, again, is a memory. It's a form of communicating an aspect of somebody's experience that they are unable to remember and that they are unable to put into words. Okay? And what's his last one here? He does not remember having been intensely ashamed of certain sexual activities and afraid of being found out, but he makes it clear that he is ashamed of the treatment in which he is now embarked and tries to keep it secret from everybody. Another example of how somebody's normal way of dealing with things, the issues that hold them back in their life are, again, they're not remembered, they are enacted. Let's see. Then he goes on and he says that it starts with a repetition. And there's this bizarre sentence about a repetition of a homosexual attitude. Okay? I didn't track that one down. Do you know, Mara? Do you know? I'll tell you what I think he's talking about, which is just an example of Freud and his culture and some of his bizarre eccentricity. Somehow or another, Freud always had the idea with homosexuality that the person who was homosexual was the one who was receiving. The one who was actually doing the fucking was not homosexual, and the one who was getting fucked was. And somehow or another, I think what he's saying here is that when the person is being silent, they're being passive. Okay? Yeah. But, you know, every now and then, Freud, as brilliant as he was, some really bizarre little thing would just sneak out, get enacted. Okay? Okay. As long as the patient is in treatment, he cannot escape from this compulsion to repeat. Okay? So in other words, you can't turn it off. You can't say to yourself, I can step out of my life and I can just remember. Similarly, you cannot say to the patient, stop acting out, just try to remember. Now sometimes, of course, it's very helpful to say to somebody, what you're doing is a kind of a memory. Try to think of it that way. Try to think that whatever you're doing is a memory. It's not something that's happening in the present. But that's a way of trying to help somebody remember and help somebody to talk. It's giving somebody the idea that there's a relationship between what they experienced in the past, what they don't remember, and what they're feeling in the present. But it's not an automatic thing that can happen on the basis of an instruction. For he says, in the end, we understand this is his way of remembering. Now, there is something that he didn't describe here, so I call this incomplete, which happens very often, which is that people do remember, and nevertheless, they're still in the grip of the feeling. Okay? So, although he puts up this rather elegant dichotomy between remembering and repeating, in actual clinical fact, what happens often is that people do both. And it's hard to know exactly what that means when they do both. Does it mean that they're remembering some of it, but they're not remembering all of it? Does it mean that they're still so attached to it for some reason, as most of us are, that they can't let go of it? Freud would later call that, I think, some of the id resistances and some of the superego resistances. But in any case, I'd say the dichotomy doesn't really hold firm, but the idea that there is a relationship between remembering, acting, and repeating certainly holds extremely firm. So then he says, what interests us most is the relation of this compulsion to repeat. Okay? People have made a lot of the idea that there's no, some people say, well, it's not a compulsion to repeat, it's a dread to repeat. Or it's not a compulsion to repeat, it's a traumatic demand on them that they repeat. As if there's something wrong with the compulsion. He's trying to describe something that happens. He's trying to describe something that happens inevitably. I don't think there's any value judgment here at all. What there is a description of what he sees. Okay? And he says, he's talking about resistance. Now, interesting, he does not define resistance here at all. One of the most important words in the classical psychoanalytic vocabulary, and the only definition of it that I'm aware that he gives is that it's anything that stops the flow of associations, which doesn't tell you a whole lot. He actually later elaborates a number of sources of resistance, and he elaborates different types of resistance: id resistance, superego resistance, secondary gain resistance. He's got a whole little catalog. But he doesn't really describe what's causing it there. He discusses this more in that other paper, Dynamics of the Transference. But he's describing here is that resistance is in some ways the enactment. It is the acting in. He says the patient yields to the compulsion to repeat, which now replaces the impulsion to remember. Because his instructions to patients, remember, were to say everything that comes to your mind, don't censor it, say everything at all, train yourself to do that. This is the fundamental rule of psychoanalysis, and that involves remembering everything that happened to you. So it's replaced by the impulsion to repeat. So as he repeats, the repetition becomes a resistance against remembering. Now, let me give you a little definition that comes from modern psychoanalysis, and some other schools may use it as well, that I think helps a bit here. A resistance is a defense, which is to say some operation of the mind that serves to protect somebody from a feeling, a thought, an impulse, or a fantasy that is more or less painful or intolerable. So that the defense is anything that the mind does to keep a painful feeling out of consciousness. Once that defense comes into operation in transference, then we call it a resistance. And what is transference? Transference here is nothing more than the repetition that starts when the patient ends in treatment, in which the analyst has come to play an important role in the repetition. So when the patient experience comes in and says, I have nothing to talk about, I feel like everything I say is stupid, that's one. Or I don't want to talk about that, that would be boring. Or you would think that's ridiculous. Or why should I say it? You probably already know it. In all of these attitudes and all of these conscious reasons that one doesn't communicate one's feeling, the analyst has become involved as a character within the repetition. Okay? So it's the analyst who might think that what the patient is thinking is stupid. It's the analyst who might be bored by what the patient is saying. It's the analyst who theoretically already knows what the patient says, and why should they have to say anything? So in all of these cases, the analyst is now both the target of some aspect of the repetition, and they're an actor in it. So what has happened? The repetition has become interpersonalized. The repetition, which has existed in some ways in the patient's mind as they go through life experiencing things over and over again within a particular way, has now become a drama between the patient and the analyst. So one little side note that I meant to say earlier but neglected about what the repetition is. When I say that we all believe in it, there's some other terms that are used currently that are more or less equivalent to repetition. One of them is organizing principle. It's a lovely addition to the literature. It adds a particular facet to the concept of repetition because it gives you the idea that within the patient's mind, the repetition is organizing how they feel things, how they perceive things, and how they interact with other people. So what happens, though, in transference is the organizing principle, which was contributed by the intersubjectivist, or the repetition, again, becomes interpersonalized. It becomes relational. It becomes intersubjective. All of these are different words to describe that something that the patient was carrying around internally has now become part of a new relationship. What was repeated in the past will now be repeated with the patient, with the analyst, in the analytic relationship. And again, the analysis is a relationship as soon as that happens. Okay. He says the greater the resistance, the more extensive will acting out, parentheses, repetition replace remembering. Then he contrasts that with hypnosis, but we don't have to worry about hypnosis because nobody really does hypnosis like that anymore. But he says, if the patient starts off in a mild state of transference, remember, transference is the repetition interpersonalized. if he starts off in a mild positive state of transference, then the memories will come easily. On the other hand, nothing much important will be remembered, okay? Because as long as there's no resistance, the repetition is relatively quiet. Okay? But if, as the analysis proceeds, the transference becomes hostile, in other words, the analyst is experienced in aggressive light or persecutory light, or in some ways there's no harmony between the analyst and the patient, or unduly intense. In other words, the love feelings become too strong, or the desire to be with the analyst becomes very strong, and therefore in need of repression, okay, then remembering at once gives way to acting out. So that again, as the transference becomes more intense, there's going to be a stronger and stronger impulse to repeat instead of remember. This is expectable. This is desirable. This is not just a pain in the ass, no matter how difficult it may feel at times. The patient isn't doing this to be obstreperous. They're not doing it because they're a neurotic fuck. They're doing it because they're in treatment, because we are trying to conjure up the past and repeat it in the present. Okay? Let's see. So what gets repeated? Okay? He repeats, let's see. He repeats all of his symptoms in the course of the treatment. And he repeats all of his character traits, all of the things that have been forgotten, that have found their way into his personality, even though he may not remember where they came from. So in other words, they're just going to repeat who they are with you. Everyone repeats who they are with the analyst. Let's see. Now, one thing that Freud didn't talk about here that I think may be more recognized these days, which complicates things a little bit, is in one of his earlier papers, he talks about more than one repetition. But I think for conceptual reasons, he tends to talk about just one. In some of the case histories, he'll give a number of different ones. But one of the interesting things that happens in analysis is that sometimes, indeed often, the repetition that comes into the analysis and the transference that occurs with the analyst is not going to be the one that's discussed in the patient's outside life. So for instance, they may come in and they constantly have combative relationships with everyone that they've ever worked with. They can't get along with anyone in a working situation. They're cantankerous, they get fired, they're extraordinarily difficult, they find nobody can get along with them. So you might hear that history and think, oh, this is going to be difficult. They're going to want to change their time all the time. They're going to want to have longer sessions. They're going to want to have shorter sessions. Whatever it is that you want to do, they're not going to want to follow it. And it's nothing of the sort. They're nothing but cooperative. They feel completely understood by you. They're absolutely delighted by you. They feel comforted, and they never feel like fighting. Okay? Now, in some ways, we could look at that and say, well, that's that mild positive transference, and it's covering up everything else. But another way of looking at it is that's one repetition that they had. They're either repeating some needs that were not met in development, or they're repeating a very wonderful moment in the relationship with their parents, or they're repeating a fantasy of having a perfect relationship with somebody. But it's a fundamentally different repetition than what gets activated in the outside world. So although Freud is saying here that everything is going to be repeated, the fact is some things get repeated and some don't. Some things get repeated early in the relationship and some things don't. So it's a little bit more complicated than he describes it here, and that it's often taught as in books, in which it seems as if there's only one kind of transference that unfolds over time, and that all of the patient's problems are connected to that one transference. Okay? But that, I would say, is an addition to what Freud is saying. I don't think that's contradicting anything at all here. Okay? Let's see. Here's another thing that I particularly like on this page. We have only made it clear to ourselves that the patient's state of being ill cannot cease with the beginning of analysis, and that we must treat his illness not as an event from the past, but as a present-day force. Okay. So, I said at the beginning that it was a theory of pathology. And in a sense, the whole focus on repetition is an explanation of pathology. At this point, we're talking more about the treatment relationship. Okay? So in order for the treatment to work, all of these things must be brought into the analysis. Now, whether or not everything can be brought in a single repetition, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that whatever the patient brings in is a present-day force that we deal with in the analysis. And whatever else we talk about with the patient, the main focus of our work, whether we discuss it with the patient or not, is what's going on between the two of you. Okay? Now, some analysts would say the only thing you should be discussing is what's going on between the two of you. Other analysts would say you're always working with what's going on between the two of you, whether or not you're actually discussing it. Okay? I lean toward the second view. I think Freud went back and forth. Freud at times seemed to want to only discuss what was seemed to think that the most important thing was what was going on between the two, but he would often discuss everything else in the patient's life as well. Let's see. But again, the illness is brought in piece by piece within the field and range of the operation of the treatment. While the patient experiences it as something real and contemporary, we have to do our therapeutic work on it, which consists in a large measure in tracing it back to the past. Okay? So Freud's theory of treatment here is pretty straightforward. Although the patient cannot remember, although the patient repeats, what we want to do is show the patient that what they are experiencing now is a memory. So there's a tremendous emphasis in Freud's work in general and in this paper on turning these repetitions into memory and pointing out to the patient, this isn't something new, this isn't something real, this is a sort of memory. So while he says that the patient can't simply do that, our work consists in showing them that that's the case. That in fact, what they are feeling is a memory. However, this is not easy. Repeating, as it is induced in the analytic treatment according to the newer technique, implies conjuring up a piece of real life, and for that reason cannot always be harmless and unobjectionable. This consideration opens up the whole problem of what is so often unavoidable, deterioration during treatment. Okay? So, even though we're trying to come up with memories, this is a pretty miserable thing at times, because most of what is repressed is pretty miserable. Most of what is repressed, by definition, is not going to be pleasurable. It's not going to be happy. It's going to be dreadful. Okay? So while we're trying to bring people's memories back to them, they're going to be fighting us tooth and nail, as they should, as any sane person would do. Nobody would want to voluntarily do this unless there was a very good reason and a very good promise that it will make them better afterward. Otherwise, the attitude, let sleeping dogs lie, is probably the best one. So we have to be pretty confident of the fact that bringing up these feelings and allowing people to have this kind of misery with us in the present, which is not going to feel like something they're just remembering, is worth it. Okay? And one of the things that happens, he says, when you start doing this, is how little the patient knows about what they're feeling. This I thought was very interesting. He says, the patient has usually been content with lamenting it, despising his illness as nonsensical, and underestimating its importance. For the rest, he has extended to its manifestations the ostrich-like policy of repression that he has adopted toward its origins. So people come in and they start talking, and they start talking about their problems, and they can go on in great detail about their problems. Well, every time I get in this relationship, I get with somebody who's so demeaning. Why is it that I can't find somebody that respects me? Every time I get into a relationship, they exploit me. They take my money and then they dump me. Every time I get in a relationship, they end up they desire me intensely, and then they stop sleeping with me after 6 weeks. Why does this happen? So then you start asking them some questions about it. And no matter how much detail they've given you, you ask them a little bit more, and they immediately start with, I don't know. I don't know. Why do you think that happens? I don't know. Well, how do you feel when that happens? I feel scared. What's it like to feel scared? I don't know. So there's a level of consciousness of unhappiness. There's a level of one's consciousness. But as soon as we try to probe even deeper, we find that almost nobody knows all of the details. There's always a point at which they're comfortable knowing what they know, and you pry just a little bit deeper, and then it's gone. And then you know that there's a mechanism of defense operating. Now for Freud, he's always talking about repression. These days people like to say dissociation more. But there are many, many ways that people defend against knowing these things, defend against remembering things. Okay. So Freud then says the treatment is not helped by these attitudes. Well, clearly. At some point, he seems to forget what he said earlier and forgets that this is involuntary. But this next paragraph is absolutely wonderful. He says, he must find the courage to direct his attention to the phenomena of his illness. Or to put it another way, the patient has to find the courage to start attending to what they feel, to start attending to the details of what they feel, to attend to the intensity of what they feel, to attend to the content of what they feel. His illness itself must no longer seem to him contemptible. How many patients come in and say, you know, I do this all the time. It's so stupid. It's just so stupid. Why do I do that over and over again? I say that myself all the time, okay? It's true. But nevertheless, if you want to deal with it, you can't treat it as being contemptible. His illness must no longer seem to him contemptible, but become an enemy worthy of his mettle. Okay? I don't know. Should your illness be your enemy? But then look at the next one. A piece of his personality which has solid ground for its existence. In other words, good reasons for having it. One doesn't fall ill. One doesn't have internal blocks to getting what you want because you're stupid. There are always good reasons for it. There was always an adaptive purpose for it. There was always some aspect in which one's illness, no matter how unpleasant, prevented something worse, prevented some degree of recognition of a reality that was probably intolerable. Okay? And it has things of value for his future life to be derived from it. That's an interesting sentence. I've heard it almost nowhere else in Freud, and very few people talk about it. How many people talk about not just coming to terms with a problem, not just resolving it, but looking at that problem and seeing that there are things of value in it? There's a degree of acceptance of every aspect of the personality that comes in that phrase that I think is absolutely wonderful. It's a little bit like Nietzsche's comment about how you have to learn to love your fate, all of it, the good, the bad, the ugly, to the extent that you would want to repeat it over and over and over again, that's the only time when you've reached a level of self-acceptance. Freud isn't going quite that far, but he's saying whatever problem you have, there's something valuable in it. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't specify what that value is. Now, to some extent, Freud was always looking at impulses, which he called instincts or drives, and how they were blocked by neuroses. So one thing that he was definitely looking for in illness was to free up all of those impulses. Not all of them so that they could just be gratified in a wanton, rampaging way, but so that you had access to everything that drove you, to your desires, to your passions, to your interests. And that being blocked in that was so much of what Freud thought constituted neurosis and illness. So one thing that one gets from one's illness is the freedom to tap the energy that has been locked away. And we're not talking about neutral battery electric energy here, the way some parodies of drive theory might have it. We're talking about life force. We're talking about the desire to be involved with other people, the desire to love, the desire to work, the desire to realize yourself in the world. So that's why when you're looking at your illness, you're not just peeling it off. You're not just throwing it in the garbage. You're taking what's of value in it and you're reintegrating it into your personality. It reminds me of another line that came from this that was in Melanie Klein, where she's talking about splitting. And as I'm sure many of you know, splitting is a defense in which one piece of your personality is sort of split off from the rest of it. So that if you split off from your aggression, or you split off from your libido, you no longer have that piece accessible to you. It's a completely Freudian idea. But what she says is, the problem with splitting is that every time there's a split, you've cut a piece of yourself away and you no longer have it. You've weakened yourself. That you need every aspect of your personality, you need every aspect of your character, all your love, all your passion, all your interest, all your drive, if you're going to get what you want out of your life. So drives are not just something mechanical that keep you moving. Drives are what makes life meaningful. Now, he's not talking about drives here, but he's talking about all the passion that underlies, that you've cut off by not having access to it. Okay. So, as this happens, what happens? Does the patient say, oh boy, I'm free? By moments, yeah. Sometimes patients get a glimpse of it. They feel a greater freedom. Once they've actually started talking about the feelings, once they see that they're not going to die from having the feelings, at least occasionally they feel like they're not going to die from having the feelings, there's a growing sense of liberation. And then the feelings get worse. Then the whole struggle that underlay the repetition, the defense against remembering, the defense against experiencing the feelings, starts up again. So what happens? The patient feels worse. I was supervising a case just last week. How often? You don't hear this very often. And the patient says to the analyst, you know what? I was rather limited before I came in, but I felt much better. Now I feel much worse. I'm not sure it's worth it. I'm not sure that I didn't want to go back to the way I was. Okay? Now, this patient was actually in a state of very high self-awareness. This is a state where all of the feelings were coming through, and even though she was thinking she wasn't going to continue forward, she understood why. Because it hurt more, because there was stuff that she accessed that she couldn't stand before. And then, I pointed out just because nobody's perfect here. He says, young and childish people in particular are inclined to make the necessity imposed by the treatment for paying attention to their illness a welcome excuse for luxuriating in their symptoms. So after all the sophisticated understanding, he comes out with this sort of moralistic bourgeois, grow up and face the world kind of attitude here. It's interesting that he could be so radical in so many ways, and then all of a sudden something completely conventional would come in. I mention this also because he's hinting at what he later called secondary gain. Secondary gain is when somebody has a problem, and I think his classic example was that somebody's in the war, they lose a leg, so they can't work anymore, so then they go out and they sell pencils or they beg on the street. And somehow or another, he had the idea that they come to like begging on the street more than they would like, to work and have money. So they've gotten so much gain from not being able to work and from being able to beg for money instead of working that they prefer that state. I'm not saying that never happens, but it's one of those. It doesn't feel like it's a terribly sophisticated understanding of what happens in trauma and why people become attached to their symptoms. Anyway. What else happens? As you unpack these problems, as the repetition slowly gets loosened, as the struggle between memory and acting gets more and more intense, new things that the patient never had problems with before come up as well. And then you think, well, they came in and all they were a little bit inhibited about talking on stage, and now they're terrified of being abandoned every time their husband goes out to, get a bottle of soda from the store. Have I made them worse? Well, you haven't made them worse, but you have made them feel worse, because once you start dismantling, moving around with the psychic structure, you really don't know what's going to happen. Okay? Unfortunately, people are very, very complicated. And you can never tell when you first meet somebody what will be lying beneath the surface. One of the things that makes this job so absolutely wonderful, and one of the things that makes this job so absolutely horrifying, is that you can work with somebody for years and years, and after 8, 9, 10 years, they have the capacity to surprise you in ways that are truly distressing. I had a patient once I was working with for 9 years, And then it turns out he's a multiple personality disorder, okay? Now, could I have seen it before? I don't know. I couldn't see it. But I assure you, when his first alter came out, I was pretty damn surprised, because I sort of had the idea that I knew what was going on. But as we moved as these defenses loosened, whole areas of his personality that had been so thoroughly dissociated came charging back in a way that was absolutely terrifying. And as far as I can tell, there's no way to avoid this, except see people for a very short period of time. Okay? Freud's analysis were, most of them were 6 weeks, 12 weeks. I don't know. Did they ever go for 6 months even? Do you know, Mer? What?
I don't know.
I don't know. I think 6 months is probably the outer limit. Okay? Now, true, he was seeing them every day, sometimes 6 days a week. But nevertheless, there's no substitute for time. Frequency does not substitute for time. The longer you work with somebody, the more stuff can come up, and that's just the way it goes. So then he describes this technique as a constant struggle. Patient wants to enact. You want to show them what's stopping them from remembering something. You want to point out the resistance. And every time you can get them to remember something instead of acting it in, he calls that a victory. Now, I call that a victory too, okay? I said that a little bit ironically. My only problem with it here is that at times it starts getting adversarial. He starts off with the idea that the repetition is inevitable, but then he says, what are we trying to do? We're trying to wrest their, he says at one point, the patient will use every weapon in the armory of their past to prevent this from happening. And we have to wrest that weapon from them, those weapons from them one by one. I don't know. You start wresting people's defenses away from them, you tend to get a lot of chaos. You start taking away the methods that people do to protect themselves without creating enough space, without creating a degree of safety in the relationship, without creating the sense that there'll be something there when the defenses come down. You tend to get lots and lots of chaos, and then you get very serious aggravations. So that particular analogy of wresting the weapons one by one, I don't recommend that one bit, okay? He also talks here about what happens when people start doing unwise things in treatment, because it isn't just what goes on between the two of you. He says everything that goes on in their outside life is going to be tinged by the treatment. Okay? So that you may be a drama, you may be a central figure in a drama, but you don't know what that drama is. So if a patient starts quitting their job, for instance, it may be because they think they have a fantasy that you're going to take care of them. Where does that come out most often? Well, I decided to quit my job. I can't pay anymore. Will you now see me for free? Okay? Or not free. I'll pay you 75 cents, but I can't pay you what I used to pay you. So everything that they're doing may be tied back to the transference. So while we're looking at this repetition, we can't look just at what's going on between us and the patient. We have to look at everything that the patient is doing and try to see how we might be involved in it. Okay? Now, his solution to this was make them promise not to do anything important during the treatment. Okay? Like get a new job, like get married, like do what? Okay, I guess you could do that if the treatment was lasting 3 months. You know, right? Okay. Now that we're into 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years, please don't do anything important in your life for the next 30 years, because we really want to make sure we get this right. Okay. Sometimes people will say don't do anything important without discussing it in an analysis first. That makes more sense, but you know what? Good luck. Okay? Why? Because they're not going to tell you. They won't know. They won't know what's important. You won't think what's important is what they think is important. And most importantly, they'll think you're trying to control them, which you are. And then we start getting very confused about what's a transference and what's going on in the real relationship. Okay? Let's see here. All right. He says, the main instrument, however, for curbing the patient's compulsion to repeat and turning it into a motive for remembering is the handling of the transference. Okay? We render the compulsion harmless, indeed useful, by giving it a right to assert itself in a definite field. We admit it into the transference as a playground into which it is allowed to expand. Playground. And again, such a contemporary thought. I've heard so many contemporary theorists say, what we're doing here is we're playing with these ideas. We're playing with the relationship. This should be a sandbox, not a boxing mat, not a boxing ring, not a debating society. So I was really struck to see that he was using that analogy as a playground this early in the treatment. Well-intentioned. I have to say, to both Freud and the contemporary people, yeah, sometimes it's a playground. Most of the time, it's not. Okay? Most of the time, it's anything but a playground, because to the extent that this is a repetition of real painful feelings from the past or real loving feelings from the past, it's anything but play. That doesn't mean that you can't play with the patient. That doesn't mean you can't have wonderful times laughing together. That doesn't mean that there isn't enjoyment. But what's going on is very, very serious. And it's not a rehearsal. It actually is real. He's trying to capture that throughout this whole paragraph. It is a piece of real experience, but one which has been made possible in especially favorable conditions. It is itself of a provisional nature. He's trying to capture, and he was the first one to see, that although it's a repetition, that doesn't make it any less real in the present. And more important than that, the analyst's presence is very real in the present. Okay? The analyst is not just something that is projected upon and then is not involved. If one would say that there was one dimension of the repetition that Freud was either not aware of or left out in this account, it's the fact that as the patient repeats, they also make the analyst a part of the repetition, and the analyst, in emotional resonance through emotional communication, participates in the repetition. So it is not just a memory for the patient, but becomes a real relationship that is being repeated to a greater or lesser degree, in which the analyst is having feelings that correspond very strongly and very precisely to what the patient is repeating. Now again, we can call this the interpersonal dimension, the intersubjective dimension, the emotional communication, objective countertransference dimension. But for that reason, calling it a playground feels like that's nice, but it's not capturing the whole intensity of the whole thing. It is only because it is a real relationship that this actually works. It is only because the analyst is a real figure in the patient's life, albeit shaped by transference, that the analyst has any power to change the repetition. Now there's a sort of a tension in Freud between two different ways of looking at what happens in treatment. One way is the repetition becomes a way of gathering evidence. It's as if it's an experiment. You put the patient in this particular setting, the repetition unfolds, both you and the patient can observe the repetition from a distance and comment upon it. Okay? And in that way, it's almost as if the treatment is a source of information. And sometimes Freud talks as if that's what the case is. And because the patient is feeling it at the same time that the information is available, the patient sees how strongly, how accurate the analyst's observations are. But then there is another sense in Freud where he says, the transference thus creates an intermediate region between illness and real life through which the transition from one to the other is made, which suggests that this relationship is a very real, in the present relationship, no matter how strongly it is shaped by the past. And that also comes through in some of his comments about technique. He says in one paper that intellectual insight is never strong enough to turn the tide against the repetition. He said for that, what matters is the patient's relationship to the doctor. So insight and interpretation alone are never sufficient to make the change. Now, what's his idea of what the real relationship was? He says, well, if you listen to the patient carefully, if you take a serious interest in them, if you clear away the early resistances, it will simply happen naturally. True as far as it goes, perhaps, but a relatively unsophisticated understanding of the emotional dimension of the treatment. Again, it was one of these areas where he seemed to be able to go very, very far, and yet when it came to a certain crucial thing, he kind of fell back on common sense. So I think many theorists have come up with much more clear understandings of what happens between the patient and the analyst that helps the patient to move forward. Okay? But certainly the notion that the analytic relationship is what's crucial to the treatment, it's here right in Freud. I just love that line about how this is an intermediary zone in which the transition from one to the other is made. And finally, we get to the concept of working through. Okay? So once we start pointing things out, once the patient starts remembering, once they understand more, once we start using our feelings in the relationship and help to free the patient up through that as well, does everything just go away? No. What do? We do it over and over and over again. And then once we've done it over and over and over again, then we start over again, and then we do it over again. Okay? It goes on and on and on. The treatment is absolutely incremental. Occasionally, you get these things where you do something and you say something and it changes something forever. And we all love those, and those are great things to write articles about because they're interesting articles. Okay, but how often does that really happen? The working through means you reach something, you point something out, you either have an interpretive interchange, or you have an intellectual, or you have an emotional interchange. It seems to make things budge, and it moves things just a little bit, because we see that the repetition is tenacious. It means that we have to keep doing it over and over and over again, repeating interpretations, repeating emotional communications, trying to figure out what was left out, trying to see if there's more memories, more experiences, more areas of defense, more areas of trauma that have somehow or another not come out yet. And maybe that's what's holding the patient back. But whatever it is, it takes a long time, and we have to do it over and over and over again. And that he calls working through. And it reminds us that there aren't one-shot trials in psychoanalysis. It's not that you can try something and make it work and see whether it's working or see whether it's not working. There's always a time element. We're always dealing with a very complicated kind of relationship in which there are layers of the present, there's layers of the past. They get warped like geology, so that sometimes the past is on top and the present is at the bottom. It's always complicated. We never know the full extent of everything that we say. And in order to do that, we just got to keep working. We got to keep talking, and we got to keep digging. And how he came up with that when he was only working, 12 weeks and things like that. At some point, my sense is that he got tired of it, and he sent people on their way. Okay? Or they had dramatic improvements, stuff that today we would say, well, that's really good, but we don't think they're finished yet. And he'd say, bye. Okay? Because, he got tired of things, and he was always interested in making new discoveries. And he seemed to get tired of working with the same patients over and over again. But when he saw stuff, he really, really saw it. Anyway, those were my thoughts about this paper. Okay. And thank you. Thank you. Any questions, thoughts? Any commentary of your own thoughts or anything? Feel free. Yeah, okay.
Or what developmental period?
Well, Freud's work, it's an interesting question. Freud's work focused very strongly on the 3 to 5 range, I would say. He was he recognized and saw that there were earlier developmental theories, but that things really seemed to happen in the 3 to 5 range around the Oedipal period. Although the big joke about Freud and about Freudian psychoanalysis, even starting in the 30s and the 40s, was, Freudians linked everything to your mother. In fact, Freud linked almost everything to the father. There was much more focus on the relationship of the father and the relationship on father relationships. This was when repression would set in, okay? And repression was sort of Freud's idea of, it was the paradigmatic defense. Bye. Paradigmatic defense, the defense that stood for everything else. He recognized other defenses, but he sort of viewed repression as the most important one. However, he was also very clear that there was a whole world that he didn't know anything about. And he called it and it was the world of the mother, and he said that the world of the mother, the maternal transference, lay beneath the world of the father the same way the Minoan civilization lay beneath the classical Greek civilization. And the Minoan civilization he had associated with matriarchy. And he talked about this particularly with one patient, Hilda Doolittle, the great lesbian poet, and who thought the world of him and he thought the world of her. And he said that her problems were related to the earliest possible transference. And he said we'd never be able to get to there until we had more women analysts, because he didn't seem to think that patients could have maternal transference as the male analysts. So that would be the answer from Freud, to the best of my knowledge. I would say defenses start at the very, very beginning, and they're different all the way through the lifestyle, but there's defenses that are probably related to the first 6 months of life. There's defenses that are related to every developmental period, and people develop new defenses in adulthood as well. So when defenses really start at the moment when a feeling becomes intolerable and the infant figures out something that they can do to make the feeling more tolerable. And so on the one hand, when they do that, it means that they have adapted to the world and they have taken care of themselves. On the other hand, they have shut off a piece of their experience by lowering the level of its intensity and by lowering its connection to the outside world. So at every step of the way, a defense is a compromise between making yourself better but limiting yourself. Okay? Anything else? Any good clinical stories? Anything? Yes?
Well, I was just thinking, you were saying about how the repetition goes on and on.
Yeah.
And obviously the analyst is in the repetition.
Yes.
But I remember hearing another interpretation of the fact that the analyst's awareness and the fact that the analyst can choose, if they can, to behave, to respond differently within the context of the old repetition, can be the curative factor.
Right.
The fact that what the person experiences with the analyst is actually not what they experience with some, significant repetition.
That's an interesting question. Okay. On one level, everyone agrees with that. Okay. The original idea that the analyst should be neutral, which came from one of Freud's papers from this period as well, was the idea that you should not act in the way that the patient is expecting you to in terms of the repetition. You have to act differently. Okay? Now that doesn't mean, what that's meant in the history of psychoanalysis has really varied a whole lot from school to school. But the original idea that Freud had, and that to some extent everyone aspires to, but in very different ways with different schools, is we don't act exactly the same way that the patient wants us to act, unless we're doing it for a very specific reason, okay? If we're doing it in a way that we think is going to change a defense, modify a resistance, and give the patient a completely different kind of experience, then we might act exactly the way they're expecting us to, if we think that's going to change things, okay? But there's different ways of acting and reacting. When I say that we have the same feelings that the patient assigns to us, that's at particular moments, and it's often unconscious. Okay? Sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's unconscious. When it's unconscious, we call it an enactment. When we are, without awareness, behaving in the same way that they're expecting us to behave, and we're simply repeating something without doing anything different, that's one way of looking at an enactment. Then there's also the states where we're experiencing something that's consistent with their feeling, but we're not overtly acting on it. We're conscious of it, and we're controlling ourselves. And it's in that moment that we can decide to act differently, the same, or something in between. Okay? So.
But is that in fact curative?
What?
Is it curative if the analyst acts differently than?
Well, the expression that I always liked was the analytic environment has to be similar enough to be compelling, different enough to be curative. If it's not similar enough to be compelling, then the patient isn't interested in you and you're not an emotionally relevant figure in their life. If it's not different enough to be curative, then all you've done is repeat what happened to them before, and that's very rarely of value. Once in a while it is, okay? But they have to do something different then. Sometimes you're as bad as the parent is, the patient comes in and they say, "You're horrible, I hate you, I'm leaving. Get lost, fuck you, I'm blackening your reputation, and I'm out the door." Now that can be very curative for them. They have done something different, even if you haven't done something different. Personally, I don't like to put my money on that kind of treatment, okay? I think it's a little risky, but that does happen. It's usually not intentional. Yeah. Anything else? No? Yeah.
In terms of if the patient, in terms of the analytic relationship, the patient may never remember.
Good point. Yes. Yeah.
But is there something happening in terms of what is
Yes.
working through, what's reconstructed in terms of?
Thank you so much for that comment. Yeah, that was in there, but it was one of those things I forgot. Okay, and it goes directly. What?
Would you repeat that?
Oh, the question is, what if the patient doesn't remember? Is something happening? Can something be happening in the treatment between the two of you, even if the patient doesn't remember, doesn't recover the memories? In other words, if the feelings in the present are never turned back into memory, right? Is that the question? Okay, and that goes to the heart of Freud's theory here. Freud, I think, would say, yes, in order to have a cure, you must change things back into memory. Okay? There has to be that transition, that transmutation from present feeling, from action into memory. However, I think other people would argue, and certainly I would, that the repetition can happen in the present. The patient may never remember, but because of what's happening in the present, whether it's the quality of the interpretation or it's the quality of the emotional interaction, you can fix it in the present without the patient remembering everything. From my point of view, that's absolutely possible, and it happens with many patients. Some patients need the memories, some people don't need the memories. Sometimes we can't make the memories bearable, no matter how hard we try, but we can still change the environment enough so that the defenses change and the repetition is loosened. Now, some people would argue that that leads to a therapy where you don't have to look at history, where you can change everything in the present. And I see their point. However, I think that the analyst must be thinking in terms of history, whether or not the patient thinks in terms of history. I think unless the analyst is thinking in terms of history, they don't have any kind of a compass to suggest what it is that they should do differently in the present. Otherwise, you're trying to be nice, you're trying to be confrontive, you're trying to be this, you're trying to be that, but it isn't embedded in an understanding of the patient's life. It's only by looking at the patient's history, even if you only get that through your countertransference, that you're going to have any sort of compass for what to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to add to what you're saying, that I think that especially with very early experiences that are not accessible to memory,
Yes.
as we know memory,
Right.
that it can come out in the transference, and the defenses against it, and then the transfer can come out, and the analyst can provide a way to understand that. It's when it has meaning that it is
Yeah.
no longer repeated. It doesn't have to have the direct connection to something that happened when they were 8 months old and in a body cast, you know.
Very true. Yeah, it has to have meaning. Right.
So
By helping the patient give it a meaning in some sort of context in their life, whether it's in the present or in the past,
Right.
that's what changes.
Because
Yeah.
sometimes those early memories, they're just not accessible.
They're not accessible. They happen before language.
Yeah.
It's not clear whether we can translate everything that happened. It's not clear that we can translate anything that isn't in language into language. Can we translate the quality of the color blue or the taste of a truffle into language? You know, somebody said once, you know, that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. But in some sense, writing about anything is like dancing about architecture. You know, we can give a facsimile. But, yeah. Okay. Anything else? Thank you all so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And have a good night and a good holiday. Thank you. Thank you.